Ihr ehrfurchtsbuckelnden Blassgesichter, ihr Lumpen, passt auf! Hier kommt Grosz, der traurigste Mensch in Europa. Steifen Hut im Genick, kein schlapper Hund, Nicholsons im Schädel, bunt wie ein Hyazinthen. Oh! Oh! Schon wieder brüllen die Häuserwände. Regie, Zigarette. Palasthotel, Teppich Thomas, gerade zu Hause. AEG, Steiners Paradies, Bett. Hier kommt Grosz, der traurigste Mensch in Europa. Dannemann-Zigarre, schief im Maul, Knattermotore, Knarze. Hart überholt nach Backbord, der rote Autobus. Ich bin Petropolis, der Kautschukmann. Beweglich in allen Knochen. Den Bequemen gilt's zu stören beim Verdauungsschlaf. Rumort, explodiert, zerplatzt oder hängt euch ans Fensterkreuz. Horrido, beim Barte des Oberlehrers Wotan. Überpinselte Fäulnis, parfümierter Gestank. Grosz wittert's. Parbleu! Hier riecht's nach gebratenen Kindern.
George Grosz, born in Berlin on July 26, 1893, stinging graphic artist and painter of the faces of the ruling class, communist and America fan, Dadaist, enfant terrible of the 20s, accused of pornography and blasphemy, one of the most famous artists of the Weimar Republic. In 1932, he accepts an offer to teach at the Art Students League, a renowned New York art school.
bekomme ich ein Telegramm von New York.
In 1931, I got a telegram from New York. So I'm supposed to teach at the Art Students League. And exactly at that same moment, interestingly enough, things were getting pretty ticklish in Germany. Because somehow a pretty weird man was coming up, right? Who churned everything up. And I saw that's like someone calls to me, "Hey, you, if you stay there, you're going to be on the blacklist." So I noticed I'd lost the first round, speaking like a boxer. I noticed my drawings just weren't being heard. Nothing was being heard, so my warning was more or less thrown to the winds. The fire behind this satire, and why this satire was biting and acid, was that I hated enormously, indeed. But at the very moment I came to America, I made a kind of dream come true. This dream may be something childish, but it was alive in me. So it was really the conflict of a man who wanted to love, and I just left this hate I had in me. I just left this hate behind. That I took this demonic nature and torments, these pests, that I took, so to say, a European or maybe a Gothic or even a German inherited trait with me, yeah, that came with me. If you could see my feet, you'd see these little roots already in the Manhattan stone. They are not big, but they are there. Suddenly, I had a whole new soil.
New York artist Robert Senadella studied in George Grosz's drawing class until 1959. He was Grosz's last student in America.
This is one of the few paintings that I've never shown. I did it right after or shortly after Grosz died, and it was a very spontaneous kind of gut reaction to the first important person in my life who died, and it's I've just never been able to show it. The title of the painting is The Death of George Grosz, and for a while it was sort of the death of Bob Senadella. And the painting, even now when I look at it, it's like, takes me right back to 1959, and I see my own guts and I see his guts on this piece of canvas. And I don't even know how to feel about it as a painting. All I know is that there is an emotion that the few people who've seen it, and certainly for me, and I think it's just because his death was such a, not just a shock, but it was like when you have a teacher of this sort and someone who meant so much, it just, part of you goes with him. And in the painting, I just sort of re-noticed this when I was looking at it again, that as Grosz, who the story goes was either pushed or fell down a flight of stairs, in his shadow, I see that I put my signature, and I think even that is symbolic of would I ever get out from under the shadow of George Grosz.
On January 12, 1933, we boarded the North German Lloyd steamer the Stuttgart in Bremerhaven. On January 23rd, we arrived in New York. On January 30th, Hitler became Chancellor of the German Reich. The proletarian masses didn't defend themselves at all. In fact, they deserted in great numbers to the winning side. Then came the news of the Reichstag Parliament fire, which put everything in an eerie light. Then I knew that Providence wanted to save me. That I would have gotten out of that alive is something I really doubt.
Grosz decides to stay in America. He brings his wife Ava and his sons Peter and Martin to New York in 1933. Jazz musician Marty Grosz lives in Piermont today.
When we first came to this country in 1933, after we had left Germany, the first thing I can remember practically is we lived in a hotel somewhere in Midtown Manhattan near Central Park, and at that time they gave me chalk, kreide, and I would go out to Central Park and I would make drawings, and people would stop and say, you know, and admire me, and I got an audience. And people would sometimes even applaud when you did a little thing nicely. I'd stand up, and so I followed, and they'd say, and later on, of course, they would say, just like people would say, oh, he draws on the sidewalk in Central Park, just like his father, and genauso begabt wie sein Vater, and et cetera, and so forth and so on.
New York, huge, wonderful city. I love this city. I saw Negroes, Chinese, red-headed Irish, sailors, Broadway glowing at night, giant department stores. Saw Kent Garage and workers in overalls hanging between the red steel beams just raised up in Radio City. Saw Wall Street and the shouting brokers in the stock exchange. Saw the new Irving Trust Building and, all alone with a wealthy broker up on the 50th floor, looked out over all of New York. This city and its inhabitants of all races are full of images and contrasts. Who wouldn't be overwhelmed when you drive in for the first time and out of the distant haze the skyline emerges? Even some European asses corroborate that. And then, closer and closer, Broadway opens up like a river, and the towers of the buildings surge into your disbelieving eyes. A new, unheard of world. To me, it is and remains the most beautiful city in the world. Paris, to hell with it. Berlin, sure, hometown language, it's okay. Rome, pigsty. Petersburg, nauseating. Moscow, proletarian village. London, hats off, cool respect. New York, the city.
Besides his work at the Art Students League, Grosz led a private art school with Maurice Stern. It was on Fifth Avenue, right on Central Park.
Now I was the owner of a pretty good-sized art school on the 32nd floor of the Squibb building. I inherited the majority of my students from Maurice Stern, but gradually my own modest advertising paid off. I was really proud, and before I went into the skyscraper, I'd often go to the other side of the street, look up to the 32nd floor and say half aloud, "Boy, oh boy, your old drawing teacher Pops should see that. Donnerwetter, a giant studio on the 32nd floor and a sun deck too, all due respect." In my mind's eye, I patted myself on the shoulder and entered the express elevator, the one that doesn't stop between the first and 31st floor and soared, self-satisfied, up into the heights. Not bad, I thought. Great country, America. I was still relatively young, just 44, and my dream was more alive than ever. Almost all the women art students belonged to high New York financial circles. That gave my school something almost aristocratic, which pleased me. I was proud of my female students, and at the sight of the many fur coats hanging in the wardrobe, I often felt like the director of an exclusive club.
George Grosz was one of the closest friends of my father, Wieland Herzfelde, who actually discovered him. George helped us come to America and helped us very much in the first few years. I had the feeling, which turned out later to be false, that Grosz was really pretty established here. He also very much wanted to make this impression. He dressed smoothly and had dreamed a great deal of America. He picked us up from the ship in his own automobile. And who had their own automobile those days? He drove us through the city towards Long Island, where he lived, along Park Avenue. Then he bragged a bit, American, and said, "A millionaire lives there, and they're a millionaire 10 times over." He didn't say much about the city, the museums, restaurants, the streets, but just millionaires live everywhere. And he pretty much admired them and said, "The only thing that really counts here is how much money you have. What you do doesn't matter."
Und hat gesagt, hier gilt eigentlich nur, wie viel Geld du hast. Was du machst, ist egal.
Boy, here's Babylon, a melting pot of all races. Here's how I depict it. Fine people stroll through Central Park, almost dried out, lovely silk mummies, colorfully made up. But next to them, the ragtag, unemployed bums. Have a shine, sir, with their cute, tidy shoeshine boxes, waiting for the passerby who'd spent a nickel. A show theater, colorful, confusing, for men only. In the foyer are nackte, naked girls in photos, made up Paris style. Silk stockings, fur, otherwise nothing. Again, many nervous men in front of the theater. Admission, 75 cents, $1, or $2. All the women painted colossal, sheer clothing, consciously carried, sometimes like living wax dolls. All of them hardly demigods, even if they're pushed into the heavenly sphere, untouchable, waxy. Nobody turns around to look back or down at a Frau, a woman. Odd.
The German refugees that came over to this country could never adjust to the idea of being in America, couldn't wait to get back to Germany, and behaved as if everything American was inferior to the German product. Die Kleider waren nicht so gut gemacht, die Käse schmeckte nicht so gut, the whole thing, you know, and this would of course get George Grosz furious, and he would get drunk and really read them out, you know, and tell them off. He couldn't stand that. And at the same time, of course, he never forgot his. It didn't really work 100%. I don't think it can. And how can it ever work? It was rather funny when my mother would she would say in her German, her best English, Bobby or Jackie, would you like to come and have lunch with us? And they come for lunch, and out comes the Käseglocke, you know, with this Harzer Käse and stuff. And they're not used to that in this country. And then out comes the Wurst, the Schinken and Wurst and Blutwurst and all that kind of stuff. And they're good. And then after Christmas we had Schmaltz, and they saw me putting this goose Gänsefett, you know, on pumpernickel, and I thought it was great, you know, eating all this stuff. And they would say, please, Mrs. Grosz, don't you have some peanut butter?
The Art Students League is located in the middle of Manhattan on 57th Street. With a few interruptions, George Grosz taught here until his return to Berlin in 1959. The often hated teaching became the basis of his livelihood.
Then I have to go to the Art Students League, right back around the corner. It's a hot day. I enter, often greeted by the friendly white-haired secretary at the reception desk. "Good morning, Mr. Grosz." "Good morning. Nice day, isn't it?" "Oh yeah, nice day. Not so sticky as the day before." In fact, it's sticky as hell. I'm already sweating. But that's how Americans are. Always nice. And it's always a nice day.
Rosina Florio knew Grosz from the time he was appointed in 1932. She is now the director.
George was a very good teacher, very dedicated man to his art, and the students loved him. They all thought a great deal of him. We got along very well. I have to tell you a very sad story, though. When George left for going back to Germany, because his wife said she wanted to go there to die, George said to me, call me back, Rosina. Write to me and say I must come back." And I said, "Okay, all right, I'll do that." And then George died. And we had gone off on vacation. And when we returned, I had a large card from Germany. And it was a card from George. And George wrote on that, "Rosina, call me back, call me back." And he was dead. And it was very sad for me. And I still have that card because it's a wonderful remembrance of this man.
League has the older approach to art schools. They do not require diplomas, or they don't give out diplomas. Their idea is that your diploma is your ability, what you learn at the school. Tradition is the key word, in a way, at the League, and I certainly carry on the same basic drawing methods that Grosz taught me.
There's an old proverb, "Those who can do, those who can't teach." But like most proverbs, it's only partially true. I could do and teach. That is, make myself understood to the students and help them along. I could do that too. I let my former arrogance disappear and sink away. I banned this somewhat nihilistic, self-satisfied aspect of my nature into the basement of my being. I soon succeeded in saying pretty-sounding sentences and flatteries which I myself only half believed. Seems to please the students, my method. I take it very seriously, devote myself to each student without giving preference to anyone. I speak quite a lot with the students, also philosophically, weltanschaulich, so to say, and often draw for them from a model. That impresses them because they see what I can really do in practice. So it's not just clever words I'm saying.
Try the whole, it's on a larger size and use the whole. The League today is virtually the same as it was then. Their policies are the same. The very room that I now teach in, where I have taken the chair, the the Grosz chair, so to speak, is the same room that Grosz taught in. And it looks the same. It smells the same. There's an aura of history.
The archives of the Art Students League are directed by art historian Larry Campbell. Campbell was studying at the school on the GI Bill when he met Grosz in 1947.
I saw him again, planning to go back to Germany. And he said, I always liked you, and he gave me about 6 cigars. So I didn't like to smoke them because I felt that they were kind of like a magic talisman of some sort. So I put them in a drawer, and they slowly disintegrated into powder because there was not the right kind of humidity for cigars. Grosz was one of 3 people, Europeans, that the Board of Control invited or wished to invite to teach at the Art Students League. The year was 1932. And the president of the league was a very well-known American painter, John Sloan. Sloan thought of Grosz as being an outstanding modernist, and he wanted to get new blood into the league. But at the same time, it wasn't quite realized that Grosz's own interests ran rather counter to that, and he was a fairly traditional kind of teacher.
Teachers and students of the League were involved in the anti-Hitler movement, as the Germans called it. Grosz paints a mural in the entrance hall with 3 colleagues. His son, Peter Grosz, today in Princeton, recalls the political climate during their first years in America.
Also, Grosz kam in den USA an, musste Geld verdienen.
Grosz arrived in the USA, and he had to earn money, obviously. The school of art he founded wasn't working, so he was really only a teacher at the Art Students League.
Danach hatte großes Glück, dass einen Gönner hatte in Esquire.
Nevertheless, he was quite lucky to have a patron at Esquire, the famous literary magazine. Here's a whole volume of illustrations which he did for Esquire. He didn't always like it. The drawings were printed in very small format, unfortunately. He painted them very large, very fast, had no problems, and thus earned a little money which gave him the opportunity to make fine oil paintings and to do what he wanted.
Malte die sehr groß, sehr schnell, hatte keine Probleme und verdiente dann ein bisschen Geld, das ihm dann die Möglichkeit gab, feine Ölbilder zu zeichnen und zu machen, was wollte. Sein eigentliches, wollen wir sagen, das Ecce Homo.
His actual book, similar to Ecce Homo in America, was Interregnum, which, when you look at it today, seemed almost unbelievable in its premonition of war and of this Hitler person.
Die Vorahnung vom Krieg und von dem Hitlermann. Diese Bilder, diese Interregnum-Bilder und auch die ganzen KZ- und Antikriegbilder.
These pictures, these interregnum pictures, and all the KZ concentration camp and anti-war pictures, this premonition of a frightful time which would destroy Germany. Hitler was respected in the whole world at this time. It was the rescue of Germany. In America, they were happy that Germany was coming out of the depression and unemployment. The story about the poet Musam is, there was a gathering of German and Jewish intellectuals in New York, and they'd just gotten the news that Erich Musam had died in a concentration camp. And father was, of course, cynical. What? Such a little writer? What's that mean, he hadn't written anything so important? The people were all severely shaken that Grosz would say something like that he could behave that way. But what no one knew is, on that very evening, after he went home, he drew a whole series of anti-Nazi pictures.
Was niemand wusste, ist nicht, weil den Abend, als nach Hause ging, hat dann eine ganze Reihe von Anti-Nazi-Bilder gezeichnet. Politisch hat Grosz mehr oder weniger sich distanziert. Wurde dann immer mehr humanistisch.
Politically, Grosz became more or less distanced. He became more and more humanistic. He saw himself as ever more powerless to do something, not just against fascism, but communism too.
All
during the 1930s, we had a parade of people coming through the house. It seemed like there was never a time from 1935 or 36 until 1945 that there weren't guests in our house. And of course they were all German-speaking guests. They were all people who had left, had to leave the regime. And they were fascinating, interesting people as far as I was concerned. And I think back on it, I think it was a marvelous childhood to have all these people sitting there. Hermann Borchardt, who had lost a finger in the concentration camp. His nickname was the Moorsoldat, and who would speak nicely, commendingly. I mean, he was a real Schelm. He'd say, oh, Dr. Borchardt, das muss ja scheußlich gewesen in Konzentrationslager und so. And he'd say, no, it was sehr, it was very pleasant for him, and yes, Mr. Koch and his wife Ilse were very kind, and oh, not too bad, and so, and he would put people on, as indeed my father did too. He'd make clown around with them, because and then the Herzfelder stayed with us, and it seemed always somebody. Walter Mehring, always somebody was in the house, and I liked them all. I thought they were wonderful. Of course, my father would have terrible fights. They would sit up. Sometimes I would go to school in the morning, and they would be sitting there they wore nightshirts, Nachthemd. Nachthemden, and there they would be with the beer and the wine. They already had gone through the schnapps and the whiskey, and now all that was left was the wine. And there they would be at 8 o'clock in the morning with this cigar smoking cigar, their lips black with cigars, juice, sitting there, ich verbiete mir diese, and they would be going on and on, political arguments and stuff like that, all night long.
In 1938, the Nazi government took away George Grosz's citizenship. He became an American citizen in the same year. His house in Douglaston, as later in Huntington on Long Island, became a meeting place for German exiles. One of his closest friends was poet and publisher Wieland Herzfelder.
Wieland Herzfelder was a very friendly, jolly, optimistic person. He was definitely had a feeling that one of these days communism, the Red Star, was going to really rise and triumph, and everybody in the world was going to be happy. And whenever anything went wrong, Wieland Herzfelder would, if you opened up a tin of meat or something like that, soup, and it was spoiled or something, yeah, well, of course, natürlich, the capitalist workers don't get paid enough. Why should they pay attention to their food? Everything was reduced to capitalism versus communism. And they would fight about it if the salt didn't come out of at the dinner table. Now, yeah, that's of course that's the way it is in a capitalist country. In a communist country, that would work because the workers would love their work, and so forth and so on.
If one observes humanity like a natural scientist observes and studies insects, it truly never becomes boring. This seething insect swarm displays new, small, and amusing features ever again. I'd just like to know what spiteful fairy laid this joy into my cradle, this joy in observing the human, the all too human. Take a look. The most beautiful women in the world are here. That's a fact. And where do they come from? All types, all races of the earth mix on this fertile soil. And they give the racial story of Günther a real smack on the nose. Yes, but I lose myself there and drift off to Germany. And right away, I'm more and more painfully sorry An ill humor rises up in me. I hear marching steps and commands. Destiny, hit that Jewish swine. We want to cut off the beetle braids of the Jews. Worker swine, what's going to happen to you? Can you blame a young man if he flees this political rot and seeks his luck in those countries that are still fairly free of it and which give him a better chance? I walk with open eyes through the streets and make my notes. From the ragged, unoccupied idlers who sleep on torn newspapers in Union Square to the fine, elegant idlers on Fifth Avenue who are also unoccupied. Terribly interesting for a graphic artist of my caliber. The city is rich in apparently irreconcilable contrasts. I've seen above and below, heaven and hell, sacks and silk, seen lions and tigers, sheep and goats. In spite of everything, I like it. I've become a kind of conformist in America. I didn't want to stand out. First of all, I bought a new suit. Then I bought new underwear, new socks, because I thought that would help. I had to throw off my German costume externally too. I couldn't simply be the same anymore. I mean, I was partially still the same, but in a peculiar Kafkaesque manner, I was undergoing a transformation. I mistrusted myself, and America met me halfway with its less rigid attitudes toward dressing.
Schönes Labyrinth. Im Labyrinth, das ist schön. Stundenlang kannst du da spazieren gehen. Grosz und Borchert und all die anderen. Siehst du dort wandern? Siehst du dort wandern?
Willst du hinein oder willst du hinaus? Niemand, mein Freund, kennt sich da aus. Grünes Licht, rotes Licht gibt's im Labyrinth halt nicht.
There was something unexplainably exciting in the air in Manhattan, which inspired working. After I came home in the evening from my class, I let the watercolors just pour out over the paper to hold onto what had happened to me in the city during the day. The city was loaded with impressions, and I burned with curiosity to see it all. Hopefully, the Grim Reaper just brushed by me. He tapped me on the shoulder on the Long Island train recently, but you should have seen me. I pushed him angrily onto the tracks. He had the wrong ticket.
Grosz and his family moved from Douglaston to the Hilaire Farm in Huntington, Long Island. His previous student, Marshall Glazer, follows him to the private art school in his house. Today, the previous neighbors, the Gottsagen family, live in the house.
In 1953, my parents bought the manor house, which was Hilaire Farm. Hilaire Farm was a 64-acre estate, to which was attached a carriage house. The carriage house housed George and Eva Grosz. I had the opportunity as a young person to mow the lawn for the Groszes. I would see them on occasion and help carry out their garbage. And in 1959, they moved back to Germany, and my parents moved into their home, bought their home from them. And in 1976, my wife and I moved into this home, which was the Groszes.
I don't know where the box is, but I think the painting is up here. Oh, it's so dirty. Oh my God, people would hate me for this. But I think this isn't a self-portrait of Marshall Glazer. Yeah, so dirty. But where's the little milk stand?
I think it's over there.
Yes, it is. He made so many of these funny little boxes and tables and stands, and with little holes in them, I guess, to put your fingers in.
1939, George Grosz, Douglaston, Long Island.
And I didn't know he lived there.
The artist enters his studio. Yes, here's my room. Here's my world. But it's also the shell of an oyster that quickly closes. Or, now and again, more like the house of a sensitive snail. It often echoes hollow and empty, but at the same time, like the unending melody of the sea. Pictures lean their faces against the wall, humble and modest. They're part of me. They stand like sets on a stage, waiting to be brought out again to play. Who'll grant them a glance tomorrow? Who'll buy us? Where will we wind up? How much joy's been put into them, how much remorse, how much disappointment, and how little triumph. Here's my drawing table. I painted it blue and made the footrest myself. All that your patient boards experienced with me, companion of my dreams and hopes. Here I sat and sometimes drew till morning, the whole night through. Here I covered the paper with dark lines of angry accusal, but with patterns of pure joy in decoration too. The pen flew over the paper like a great black fly, its legs dipped in ink. Out of the scribblings which no one can decipher, something like a map takes shape. The drawing board is like a battlefield, or a place of execution, or it transforms itself into an amusing and bitter diary.
coffee now that you...
My first memories of Grosz were on vacation. And we built this big, huge sand castle in Arnshoop, wonderful. And then he went away, went to the United States. So I went to school in Germany, and first class, sofort schreiben. And then we had the Lord's Prayer, and right after that, Heil Hitler. I mean, it's incredible, And then I came to this country. We spoke English at home. I mean, Pop was really very much into speaking English with the family. And he used German to speak with his German friends. But at home and with his American friends, he spoke excellent English. And the way he dressed, he dressed like an American. He always was very proud of his shine shoes, his creased pants, his English-style jacket. He smoked a pipe. He looked very soigné, and he was a handsome man. And he was always very careful to be neat and clean, except when he was painting. Now, when he was painting, he had a big apron on, and he never wanted to be disturbed. And in those days, salesmen would come to the door, and he would answer the door, because Mother wasn't home, we were in school. He would answer the door and pretend that he was the manservant, that he was the butler. And he would say, "No, Mr. Grosz is not at home, I'm sorry," and close the door. So that was his way of getting rid of people.
The studio was always Eintritt strengstens verboten. There was a sign on the door. We seldom got to see it. We were not encouraged to go in. When he was working, he would often be in the studio already when we were going away to school in the morning or before, and he would stay all day. Come down only for a quick meal, in which time he was preoccupied, and then would go back and work until 1 or 2 in the morning. That was when he had an idea, when the juices were flowing. We, once in a while during the day when my mother was out or something and I'm a little kid and I got to ask a question, I would sometimes knock on the door or something, and it was always a good time to get 25 cents or 10 cents from him for something, which was big money in those days for us kids, because he would try, it was one way he could get rid of us. Quick, yeah, okay, the ice cream man is coming down the street. Ting-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling, ting-a-ling-a-ling. No, knock, knock, knock. Ice cream man, get back. And we didn't get much, there wasn't any kind of a big, with the studio, as far as the studio was concerned, there was no big come in and sit down next to Fatih and watch him work. There are some photographs of that exist when we were just little kids that a photographer did, where the two of us, my brother and I, or I'm looking over and he's drawing and stuff. But that was the photographer's idea.
Robert Sanadella's studio is in Manhattan's Chinatown. As a politically committed artist, he's been influenced to this day by the art of his teacher, George Grosz.
When I met him, it was like just a meeting of minds. He's the first adult that I ever respected, that I had met to that time. We would get into discussions about the art of the day, the Pollocks, what we considered then, and I consider it to this day, the kind of the non-art, the turning away from reality. It was obviously very difficult for Grosz, as this giant coming from Europe, to have his, as he said, have his right arm cut off in America. And I was able to become, I think, the social critic that he might have been had he been younger in America. In other words, a lot of people say Sanadella is a kind of a continuation of Grosz, and I have no problem with that because of his own integrity. I don't draw like George Grosz. I don't paint like George Grosz. I certainly have been influenced, but only but from the best way. The greatest influence is that I was able to go my own way, but also a social critic, and I think that is where the irony is, because he didn't teach me to be a social critic. He taught me, he said, I want you to know the basics. I want you to have the freedom to go in whatever direction you want to go, and I think that's the ultimate that a teacher can offer you.
Welcome home to the USA. Freedom for one, freedom for all. Cheer for America, that's our call. Cheer for our heroes, our country too.
This is probably the most exciting 4th of July anybody could spend. New York is alive. And this year's theme for Macy's fireworks display is Cheer for America. It's dedicated to the men and women of Operation Desert Storm. And right now, we would like to take a moment to celebrate them home with a salute in sight and sound.
As Barbara and I prayed at Camp David before the air war began, we were thinking about those young men and women overseas. And I had the tears start down the cheeks. And our minister smiled back.
Freedom for all. Cheer for America. That's our call.
It was a great joy for me to sit in the dunes and absorb the landscape. I can truly say the watercolors I did there succeeded. In order to portray the grass, especially this wonderfully sharp dune grass, which artists so love, it sticks up in bushels, and there's often a circle around it from the wind and the sand. Yes, in order to portray it better, I made a brush myself in my spare time, almost Chinese. Its long handle had to be used with deliberation. It's something wonderful to work so alone in nature. Nature there was exactly the same as when the Pilgrim Fathers landed. Empty of people, the most beautiful dunes I've ever seen. In a word, we had a great time. I would have preferred to stay there much longer, since the work came so well from my hand. News of the war burst in, despite the long years of talk that it finally had to get started. Yeah, it really burst in.
The peninsula of Cape Cod near Boston became a domain for artists and writers in the 30s. Grosz came here for the first time in 1937. In the following years, he and his family spent the summers here. Ann Hamburger and Jack Hall still belong to the artist colony in Wellfleet today.
I think I met George Grosz for the first time in Huntington, Long Island, but when he came here in 1939, I used to see him quite often. I don't know what that means, you know, every week or 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times a month. I mean, we saw each other because the group of summer people, summer artists, was very small, and we all clung on to each other. And he talked in the most wonderful way. He used to talk in very fluent but heavily accented English And he would get excited by his own conversation. So he would start on one subject, and then he would make a parenthesis. He would digress, and then within that subject, he'd digress again. And I remember particularly a marvelous conversation he had about the how much he disliked modern glass and steel furniture, and how much he loved wooden furniture. And of course, we were living then amongst people from the Bauhaus, so it was a little embarrassing, but this is how he felt. And I can't really remember his sentences, but I remember a little of it. I remember that he said that a wooden table grew and was enriched by its experiences. For instance, he said, you put a baby on a wooden table and he pee-pees, and the table gets wet. And then you put beer on it and it spills over, and the spaghetti sauce spills on it. And you carve initials in it. And all of this makes of wood a living thing. And a wooden table, a wooden chair lives and grows and gets enriched. Whereas with a glass table, you can't you can't make love to the girl next door with your feet. Everybody sees it. You can't do anything. It just wipes clean. It's antiseptic. It has no life of its own at all. Glass, he said lots of other things about glass, but I remember particularly that he said glass is only good if your lover has left you, your heart is broken, you don't want to live any longer, and you put your forehead against the glass pane and it's raining outdoors and you're crying. A pane of glass is good only for that and should only be used for that. And I think that's what I remember about that particular conversation.
I once wanted to become a real painter, and now I tried anew. You might say I had to find the way to myself, out of the surrounding chaos. In the simple nature, there at the ocean, and in the dune landscape at Cape Cod, in Wellfleet and Truro, I found a certain peace. For I was almost always a haunted man. I was relatively happy and productive in these years. Ideas of extermination and destruction plagued me, as if I saw, behind the ocean horizon, the glow of a fire break out. This afflicted me, and I tried to portray it next to the more peaceful pictures.
This is the house that I remember meeting George Grosz in during, I believe, the winter of '42. I remember only really three things that we discussed. One was that I remember his telling me that he made his own watercolor brushes and that he practiced brush strokes every morning for at least a half an hour. Now, this surprised me with a man who was such a masterful craftsman as this. But of course, I suppose that's why. The other thing is that he said on several occasions that he thought that Norman Rockwell was the greatest American painter. For a while, I wasn't quite sure whether he was kidding or whether he was just making a funny remark. But I think he half believed that at that time, anyway. I mean, after all, he's fresh from the horrors of Europe, and everything in America looked very good to him. I doubt very much if he continued to believe that the rest of his life.
We had a party here, a dinner party. Everyone had drunk a good deal. And I remember somebody put something, some piece of art, some cartoon here. And one of the guests turned to George and said how much he admired Ecce Homo and that period of George's work. And George got red in the face. He was furious. And he really exploded. And he said, I hate that work. That was despicable work. I would like all that work destroyed. I spit on that work. And he turned around and he spat right on my little rug, which was right under his feet. And there were all sorts of people standing around, the rain pouring down outside, and I just watched the rug, and as people's feet moved, I pulled the rug away little by little. Finally, I was able to get hold of it, and I rushed it outside and threw it out onto the grass. But I didn't really mind his spitting on it, because I felt that this was such a physical revulsion that he'd had against his violent anger and hatred of that period, because we were now in wartime, and that hatred had grown to such monstrous proportions. You know, I felt enormously sympathetic to that.
Sometimes I'd like to live in the world of the painters who have long since been dead. I begin to paint a naked woman, aber ach, the more I progress with the work, the more it changes, and suddenly there's fire and ruins and mud and grisly debris everywhere, as if somebody who knows more and who's completely destructive leads me away. I don't know how. Odd and oppressive. Later sometime, perhaps much later than we think, this picture will stand as a document of our inner world, as a portrayal of those excruciating, apocalyptic years. The entirety is entitled Cain.
The artistic estate of George Grosz is administered by gallery owner Serge Sabarsky in New York. He began his exile in America after the annexation of Austria.
Ein Aspekt der Emigration, der eigentlich nicht genügend kommentiert oder beachtet wird, ist,
one aspect of the immigration that's actually not sufficiently commented on or respected is the fact that the immigrant comes to the new country wholeheartedly, but in reality suffers constantly from homesickness. And that's just as true for the average immigrant as for the artist too. Grosz is well known in Berlin as a great America-phile, if one can put it that way, and loved America. In his imagination, it was still the old Wild West. He came to America with all these great expectations and had the difficulty of not being able to admit to himself that he just simply couldn't play out the role that he'd played back home in Berlin, in Germany, in Europe.
Nicht einfach die Rolle ablegen kann, die er drüben gespielt hat. In Berlin, in Deutschland, in Europa. Die Apokalypse hat natürlich kommentiert.
Of course he'd commented on the apocalypse, but that's international. That referred to the whole world. It's a different Grosz. It's a different reaction, and it's a different mentality.
Ein Bestehen darauf, immer wieder die Akte zu malen und also friedliche Themen auszusuchen. Das ist ungroß und ich fürchte,
his insistence on painting nudes ever again and seeking peaceful themes, that's un-Grosz. I think it can be put down to the fact that he was just as unhappy as all the others. Feininger was born and died in New York. He spent 50 of his 84 years of life in Europe, in Germany. And after he came back, it took him 3 years to really resolve to paint again. Beckmann wasn't very happy his whole life long, but he was particularly unhappy about how he went into immigration, and that's true of all of them. It killed Kirchner and George Grosz as well.
Den Kirchner hat's umgebracht, nicht? Und es trifft auch auf George Grosz zu.
One artistic colleague of Grosz in America is the painter Jack Levine. He is considered to be among the premier critical realists of American painting today.
When I was a boy, I used to visit the Germanic Museum, which is a part of Harvard University. It's now called the Busch-Reisinger Museum. And there I saw my first drawings or lithographs, I don't recall, by George Grosz, and also others by Otto Dix and people like that. And I was enormously impressed with them. And I decided, I think then and there, that the social equation had to be very important in my life. I do think that the expression in Central Europe, in Germany and Austria and other places, represented a powerful sort of release from the School of Paris. I think that was the one place where people were painting with some sense of human meaning, the human equation, the human drama. One can think of many artists from there that did that. And the fascist regime that came into Germany killed them, exiled them, got rid of them. They destroyed what to me was a great movement. They butchered it. And someone like George Grosz was certainly a victim. He came here as an exile. He came here from divorced of all the subject matter, all the material that was second nature to him and amounted to a full expression. I don't think he ever quite found himself as an artist in America, despite the fact that he did paintings which were anti-war, he did paintings which were highly critical of society, but Germany was a special province of the social satirist. I mean, it was the utterance, the sharp, biting utterance is very close. Bertolt Brecht and people like that, to me, are the quintessence of what a political social artist should do. And I decided to do a painting of the transference of power from Hindenburg to Hitler. I had completed this painting, I think, only just in 1959 when I heard that George Grosz had died. So I dedicated the painting to him.
Well, after I met Grosz at the age of 16, there were many firsts, and most of them had to do with learning, drawing technique, but also he taught me how to drink beer. At the end of a day, he would invite me over to the Carnegie Tavern or P.J. Carney's. And today, P.J. Carney's still exists, and I find myself following that tradition as well. I take my students to P.J. Carney's, we talk about art, that kind of thing. And so the tradition carries on, whether it's the drawing or the drinking. Now, Jim, sir, how would you like me to take this American beer and make it into a German beer? Okay, do it. That's something you should be teaching me this.
It's true, right?
But here's a...
It's disgusting. Already it's disgusting.
How's that for a head on a beer?
That's a beautiful job. It's a wonderful job. Our waitresses do that.
A German beer. Here
We usually just stick our fingers in it and stir it up a little bit.
You pressed? You pressed, huh?
Ken's works better with socks.
Dirty socks.
Yeah, I'm not cleaning it up.
Really, old sweat socks.
Huh?
I prefer that. That's real German beer.
Okay.
My father was, of course, had a drinking problem that increased as he got older, as it usually does, and it became more and more a problem for him to go to dinner with people, to visit people. It became a problem for my mother. When I was a teenager, there was a constant atmosphere of tension in the house because of alcoholism. Because of his drinking, and many's a time, like when I was about 14 or 15, he was on Cape Cod. I remember he spent the summer often on Cape Cod, and I'd have to help my mother put him up to bed, get him up to bed, and take his shoes off and lay him down on the bed, and it became sometimes he would stay the whole time in his room in Huntington. I remember him in his Nachthemd, and with his 3-day unshaven, and with the cigar, the black stains of the cigar juice around his mouth, and then here would be a half a gallon of Gallo Brothers wine on the cheap wine is on the floor, inexpensive wine on the floor, and he would spend with the books piled up, and he had the green eye shade here, celluloid eye shade, and he would spend 2 or 3 days in bed like that, reading and drinking, and then being always slightly drunk, and needling. Pizzacking is what they call it, with my mother. Always, and never a straight answer until finally it would erupt into a fight, and she would come into the room and just open the windows and open the shades and let the air out. Gibst mir jetzt diese Flasche, du gibst mir jetzt diese Zigarren, and throw those all out. Und du nimmst dich jetzt zusammen. Es ist ja widerlich, and the fight and everything. And then she would tell me afterwards, she says, you don't have to be part of this. You leave. Do whatever you have to do. This is not your business. It's not if you're making.
Isn't it like that for you too? You suddenly wake up in the morning, and most of all, you'd prefer to fall asleep again, right away. I don't mean tiredness. I mean a senseless, even if sunny and splendid day outside, obviously an alcoholic in the family killing himself. A dumb song, by the way. Weh dem, der keine Heimat hat. Woe to he who has no homeland. Do you also have the feeling of having been born into a completely absurd era? There's nothing else but quiet drinking, done in secret. Many drink openly, by the way. I, secretly. To kill the moralist. I drink to kill, is what I want to say. To drown the remains of humanism in possibly feelings of justice. I think there's little hope. After the third highball, secretly, I feel more goddamn trust in God. That's what they call it. Yeah, I feel elevated and exalted. Not directly better like the other imbibers, but a little more elevated, exalted. That's all. I'm a poor sucker. That's the simple, utter truth. Everything else is debts, clowning, fraud, and the art of life. I live here like a buccaneer. You better believe it. I play the famous artist, but behind the fame, there is a big hole. So if I wanted to portray myself, there'd be pipes that pour out a stinking sewage, but also a little guitar in my arms when I open them to give a greeting, and maybe a bird's nest on my left shoulder. You can see I've been influenced by the great Bosch, Hieronymus. I waited for my lucky break like a card player or a lottery player, or a wayfaring singer or artist. Nothing stays with me but a vague, beautiful, romantic hope. Wait, my lad. Have patience. Humble yourself. Make another attempt. You'll see, one day you'll make a comeback and you'll be on top again. Believe me, sometimes I was completely down and depressed, in the way that you do feel terribly lonely in this country. Not outwardly, but inwardly. Hell spells. Lonesome man. Often like lost. Like down and out. Well, maybe too much darkness and shadow. But did you expect traffic signals in the labyrinth?
George Grosz liked jazz, and I started to teach myself to play the guitar. I bought it myself with money that I made. My mother had a radio and would get QXR in New York City and listen to Mozart and all the operas and everything, and that made him a little restless. He liked the music of the cabaret and the dance hall, and he liked this, and he would whistle these old funny cakewalks. Ba ba da 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 bum bum. Bum, 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 and he would whistle and sing these tunes, or he would sing, that eccentric, or White Washman Rags, songs he knew from his American songs he knew, and then he would do, wenn ich abends den Feger mit dem Besenzieher, about Berlin, and haben Sie nicht den kleinen Kuhn gesehen, and things like that, music hall songs and things. He really liked that, and he liked American jazz, and he would come up to the room and listen, give him a glass of, I remember he said, Ma, spiel irgendetwas. So Jazzplatte. And I would get the thing on the machine, and he would go lie on my bed, and with a glass of wine and a cigar, I'd Aschenbecher, and I'd get the Aschenbecher, and he'd have the glass of wine. He'd offer me a glass of wine too. I'm at this time 16 or whatever it is. It's okay, and we'd sit there, and I'd play him things, and once in a while I'd get out the guitar, and sort of play along. I wasn't very good, but I could sort of halfway play along with some of these things, and he would say, wenn ich nur das könnte. If I could only have done that, if I could only get that out. Sometimes tears would come to his eyes when he played these things, and I'd say, time to end the recital. Too much vino.
Made a series, The Wanderer in Nothingness. One picture's called The Painter of the Whole, another The Musician of the Whole, a third's called The Poet of the Whole. They're composed of thin but firmly drawn lines, but don't have any shadows. They're also completely gray. Their insignia, as the Romans called those things, is a real hole torn in the canvas. Wow. They only have numbers and no names. They wear slave collars, gray men in a gray world. They follow an empty, senseless banner. They have no past, only a gray present. Oh, how they hate the 7 colors of the rainbow.
George Grosz became a member of the renowned National Institute of Arts and Letters in 1954. In 1959, only a few months before his death, he was awarded the Gold Medal for Graphic Art, the highest citation for an American artist. However, the recognition of his American work came too late.
Go back to Berlin in 1959 was hard for him. They had worked out a compromise where they would spend half a year supposedly in Manhattan and half a year in Berlin. And I think, I don't think it was a happy compromise. The question then was, at age 65, would George Grosz ever really be productive again? Why wouldn't he be productive? Now that I get closer to 65 myself, I can easily see that it's not impossible to be productive at 65, nor is there any reason necessarily to stop. You change, your goals change, your ideals change, and everything. That's understandable. But he had almost come to a standstill by then. He was teaching. He would get drunk, and he would over watercolor Tuschen, some older stuff that he did in Berlin and stuff like that. Things like that. He would work on them again, take out stuff he'd done years before and paint over it, with watercolor or with white and change it and so forth. I mean, I don't know if he could have been productive. But one of the things he didn't want to necessarily, he felt bad about, was going back into that whole German thing, for many reasons. I don't know if we'll ever know really all of them, but certainly to me it seemed that it would be an admission of defeat to him. He was going to be the American, he was going to be like Norman Rockwell or something. I mean, he was nowhere near Norman Rockwell in Weltanschauung or anything, but he was going to be as successful, and he could make it. And it was sort of an admission of defeat, coming back with his tail in his legs. Oh, Berlin, well, I've been there. I was already famous in Berlin. Now I'm coming back and hear these old people saying you're famous, and for different reasons, not for the same reasons that he was the hard-hitting anti-bourgeois, anti-capitalist. Now all the capitalists buy his drawings, are buying his stuff and hanging it in their houses. He's become a good investment. So and he knew all that. And I think that, I don't know where he would have gone. But if the choice had been his alone, I don't know what would have happened to him. I can't guess. Where more and more into the woods, something like that.
komme zur Ticket Office, nicht wahr? Und der große Billettkontrolleur gibt mir ein Ticket. Vor mir steht Picasso. Und,
I go to the ticket office and the big ticket seller gives me a ticket. Picasso's standing in front of me and I get a ticket. I get 3 or 4 tickets and I say, how come? Counter closed. And then I say to Picasso, what kind of ticket you got? And Picasso says to me, yeah, Iron Express. I go straight through. And I say, hey, I don't get it. I have to transfer 3 times. So complain, says Picasso. And I want to complain, but the counter's closed. And so in my life, I've had to transfer 2 or 3 times. Sometimes I didn't even want to.
I was honored to be there to say goodbye to the master, sort of, you know. But as they began, I think it was around 10 o'clock, and they started serving little glasses of champagne. And there was a jovial mood in there and a closeness. But as the amount of champagne went from 10 to 12 to 15 to 18, it ended up at 38 glasses apiece. So obviously, we were very sober on the one hand and very drunk on the other hand. So there was this, again, these extremes, like a Grosz painting. Now, at some point, when the I know people were starting to leave the cabin room, and at that point, Grosz came up to me and said, "Well, instead of waiting till the fall to come to Germany, to come to Berlin to study painting with me, why don't you come now?" He says, "Why?" So it was half kidding and half not, but it was serious enough that I actually got into his little closet in his cabin room there. The boat was halfway out in the harbor when his wife Eva discovered me and was horrified that here I was in this drunken state, and the boat had already was already on its way to Berlin, right? Anyway, the harbor ship, I had to be actually taken over, put over the side in a harbor ship and taken back to shore in this, but it was kind of a wonderful way to be saying goodbye to Grosz for the last time. He's waving as I'm going over the edge, and it was a moment that I won't forget, even knowing how drunk I was at the time. And of course, he had his last journey just a week after he got back to Berlin. And maybe he never was sober once he got back. I don't know.
Altersheim.
längst von der Welt vergessen. Die taten nur noch welch ein Crime von der Palette essen. Der Speisen köstlich, allerlei verstanden sie zu mischen. Sollen andere sich mit Malerei den Allerwertesten wischen? Die Kunst ist beschissen! Die Kunst ist vorbei! Hoppla hopp, hey! Hoppla hei! Hey!